break, and plenty of new folks here as well. We're ready to begin with our first talk. And since Dr. Kaibara is here, Vice Provost Stone will be introducing our student.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce this student. It's her second year presenting at the JSU Student Symposium, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. I know some of you are here because a professor asked you to come and observe, and I just want you to think about presenting your own work in the future. So this is Alexzandria Quintero. She is a senior, double majoring in English and Spanish, and she worked on this project in a history course with Dr. Helen Kaibara.
Okay, so as Dr. Stone said, my name is Alexandria Quintero, and today I'm going to be presenting Pushing Perfection in How the Model Minority Myth Harms Asian Americans. So to begin, if you yourself have ever said or believed that Asian people are just naturally good at math or math-related subjects, you were not only perpetuating a stereotype, but you were also espousing an outset of the age-old model minority myth. But this is not the only notion that is very common for this myth. So here are some other ideas that are really prevalent in our American society today that come from this myth. One is the idea that Asians as a demographic have not experienced as much as severe discrimination as other groups that would have prevented them from even getting to the place where they are today. And also the idea that Asians have eliminated a path to success for other minority groups to follow. And this is where we begin to really see the essence of the model minority myth. The idea that Asian Americans have progressed to a place because of the respectable jobs that they take, the stable family units that they have developed, their culture, their values, that's what has gotten them where they are today. And if other minority groups just do the same thing, they can also be just as successful. This is not true. They have only been able to be where they are today in spite of discrimination that they have faced, most notably with Japanese internment, which we are all aware of. And so in my presentation, I'm going to be arguing that the model minority myth ascribed to Asian Americans has become increasingly detrimental towards their community and its development, as seen in the face of social stressors in the United States and the unique obstacle that they have to overcome because of the generalization that comes from the model minority myth. And so to begin with a little bit of history, during our early American years, we had a lot of influx of immigration from Asian countries as they tried to find new opportunities in America. And while we had all these different Asian groups coming, American society was kind of trying to place them, see who's better, who's the best, and more often than not, Japanese immigrants were seen as the best because the USA and Japan already had a good relationship. Japan as a nation was seen as very technologically advanced. They had a good, strong military, all the things that would make you seem ideal and respectable as a country. And so in turn, their immigrants were seen as ideal and respectable, but there eventually did come a time where being Japanese was not enough to be a respectable immigrant in America. And that's where we see the context for this quote, where we're explaining how the Japanese Association of America basically told Japanese citizens, hey, we just need to change how we are. We just need to be a little bit more respectable. Let's try and act more like Americans. Let's adopt their culture, their values, and then maybe we can continue to be accepted in America. And this is not the model minority itself, or the myth itself, but that's where we see some of the ideas present in history. But the agreed upon origin of the model minority myth is actually during Cold War America. As this quote on the screen shows, there was a lot of just conflict going on in the country at the time. We had the red menace of communism, the black menace of race mixing, and the white menace of homosexuality. So we have all these issues that the country is dealing with at this time, but notably, we don't have any menaces coming from Asian communities, and that's because we begin to see the idea that, okay, if we just focus on our community, our families, our work, ourselves, just keep our head down, keep pushing through what we're doing, pushing our discrimination that we're facing in more of a passive way as opposed to being just completely retaliating against discrimination, then that's the best approach. We don't need to cause a scene, we just need to work on ourselves and focus on ourselves. But it's important to note that that approach only works because of the Cold War. We had Asian American immigrants fighting for the country, so they gained a little bit of respect. And it's also important to note that with this idea, we're shifting responsibility from American society to minorities themselves. It's not important for America to be more accepting, to be less discriminatory. It's actually completely the work of the minorities. They need to change their values, their behavior, and then they can be accepted in American society, which is not an effective approach at all. It never has worked, and it probably won't ever work. And so where do we see the model minority myth putting Asian Americans in society? well, if there's the idea that they're the best minority, they're going to be above other minorities. But still, at the end of the day, they're Asians, they're not white, they are a minority, so they're not quite as good as white Americans. And so you can kind of see with this short graphic that I created, they're put in between white Americans and other minorities. And being put in this position causes Asian Americans to kind of face a lot of backlash that would otherwise be targeted towards white Americans, which we're going to discuss in a little bit. And not only do they receive the brunt of all of the issues more often than not, they're also very isolated because they are not seen as your typical minority, but they're also not seen as the typical American. So they're just Asians by themselves. They can't belong to either group that we have here on the screen. And so when we have this whole idea that Asians are different, we don't really understand them, and that they're completely different from every other minority because of the model minority myth, it prevents us from not only understanding them as people, but also understanding the discrimination that they face, because it's pretty unique in terms of how other minorities are discriminated against. And this was most recently seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of hate crime-based violence against the Asian American community that occurred during this time, and yet it still took over a year for the Stop Asian Hate Bill to be passed by the American government for them to finally receive the assistance that they need, the protection that they need against these hate crimes. And on a more common scale that we see this is in the workplace. Asians are often attributed to positive stereotypes such as being hardworking, and they also experience tons of microaggressions. And yet, because of model minority myth, because we can't really understand it, we're not even seeing that they're being discriminated against, and we can't help them in the way that they need to be helped. And speaking of microaggressions, just so we kind of understand what I'm talking about, there are a couple on the screen. Telling an Asian American that they speak good English because you're automatically coming to the assumption that they're not going to be speaking English well just because they don't look like the typical American, or commonly devaluing or negating Asian American achievements because, well, they're just naturally good at this thing, so it doesn't really matter that they were able to do this, that, and the third. Of course they're going to. They're just Asian. That's just what they're supposed to be doing. And so how does all of this begin to affect the way that Asian Americans perceive themselves? Well, in a study done on Asian American immigrants, first generation, first and a half generation, they were speaking to children to understand how they begin to perceive themselves as a result of this model minority myth. And this quote on the screen, the most important parts are people saying that it makes them uncomfortable and that it's very stressful because there is the idea that, okay, I'm Asian, I have to be smart, but what if I'm not smart? I feel like I'm disappointing myself, I feel like I'm disappointing my family, my community, the expectations that society has for me, I'm not even meeting them, so you start to feel disappointed in yourself. It's very stressful to have to meet a standard that maybe you yourself did not set for yourself, and yet everybody's expecting you to meet it. And this is not on the screen, but other students express just feeling that they have limited opportunities because, okay, if I'm Asian, I'm expected to capitalize off my smartness that I'm supposed to have, regardless of whether or not I'm even assisting or receiving assistance to be as smart as I'm supposed to be. And yet we reach an interesting point of the model minority myth where, yes, it is the cause of much discrimination, but there is a slight benefit, and that's what makes it so complicated and so unique, so specific towards Asian Americans. This quote explains how Asian Americans are accepted. They're among the first minority group to be accepted because they're seen as productive and efficient, but also quiet and submissive. So they can contribute towards our overall goal of having diversity in the workplace, of seeing different perspectives, but they're not being attributed towards negative stereotypes that other minorities might have. And so, okay, great, they're diverse, we have other views, but also they're just going to be there to work. And while this is a quote-unquote benefit, it really isn't a benefit because Asians often experience something called the bamboo ceiling, which is basically they get through the door and that's all. They're not going anywhere else in the building per se. They're not going to be promoted. They don't really get to progress much in their careers because they're seen as lacking leadership, not having the effective communication skills that are necessary just because they are Asian. And so we understand that while this is a benefit, it's really not a benefit. And so in conclusion, Asian American progression is not complete liberation from discrimination. Just because they've gotten to where they are today does not mean that they still do not experience discrimination in our society. The model minority myth damages the Asian American individual and the entire demographic. And while this myth prevents Asian Americans from getting the assistance they need, it's important that we understand it even though we are not Asian, because that's how we begin to dismantle it. That's how we begin to recognize and say, hey, this is not correct, this is not the type of approach that we need to have in the workplace. And only when we begin to do this ourselves are we allowed to help a demographic that has long needed help in American history but has not received it because of the model minority myth. Thank you. Any questions?
I have a question. So besides, education, what can we do to dismantle myths like this?
I would say, well, there is education, but also starting with yourself. I know growing up, you hear things in society and you don't really question them. You're just like, okay, that's just the way it is. So being able to recognize your own biases that you have are really, in my opinion, the first step before you can even try and approach somebody else about their preconceived notion that they have. Look at your own mind and see if you have any yourself.
Other questions for our speaker? All right, let's thank them again.